This week we are covering chapters 5, 6, and 7. Um, I think they were also challenging, but I don't think quite as challenging as the topic last week, where we talked a lot more about very particular parts of how economies work. Um, this week, the chapters are titled "Finance in the American Crisis," "The Challenge of New Technologies," and the last one, "Why Government?" Just a very simple question. So going through those topics, just in terms of finance in the American crisis, Stieglitz starts out by talking about the evolution of banking over time, and he's noted that banking hasn't always been the way that it is now. Um, back, even as much as around the turn of the century and going into the 20s, 30s, and 40s, banking was really a lot about lending, traditional lending, where a bank would serve to collect funds and deposits, and then use the leverage that they had from depositors to lend to other people. Very productive part of the economy. But what he said is, over the course of time, as banks have gotten into more types of business, they have been deregulated. They essentially are creating products, sometimes in the case of a loan, where they don't even service the loan afterwards. They create the loan and then they pass it on to somebody else, or they create a financial product for the purposes of generating fees. And they get into all sorts of other activities that are quite remote from what we might consider as traditional banking. He's pointed out that because of that, they've, from his perspective, they've kind of lost their way and the focus in terms of being a service to those depositors. In fact, some of that work is the least profitable work. So he talks about that, and he talks about how that led to the banking crisis, or the crisis in 2008, and also the difficulty in fixing that now. With respect to the crisis itself, he said, sure, it was probably important for the banks to be saved because they are such an important part of the economy. But he notes that it wasn't necessarily the bankers themselves that needed to be saved, or some of the key people at the top. And the divide that's now been created and exacerbated a little bit further is the fact that many individuals in this country, and people not of means, suffered the most during that downturn, and the people who were responsible suffered the least. Wes started out with that quote with respect to how much money was given as part of the bailout to AIG, and it's quite eye-opening. The next chapter, "The Challenge of New Technologies," he again talks about the theme of how technology-assisted labor is further going to increase a divide, within our society, between those who are contributing work and those, who basically are just earning money off of other types of activity. Um, it's the type of thing where he says, again, it doesn't have to be that technology is a bad thing and we all suffer from it. He just says it's got to be the transition that we're going through. We have to manage it. We have to figure out what work means and figure out how employment, full employment or employment for all, is going to be a key part of removing the inequalities that we see right now. Also, with respect to technology, he talks about the growth of the big data companies and how their accumulation of data is another way in which we actually become less. It's less democratic. The big companies that have all of the data then have market power as a result of that data, and then they potentially keep others from entering into that marketplace. And so we'll talk a little bit about that in some of our questions. He also talks about the impact of social media on democracy. And we've talked about this in other aspects of book club, where we're now we now fed what we want to read, and we're kind of in our own little bubbles. And it doesn't really lend itself to truly participating in democracy. With respect to why government, he
Jamel,
talks
can I
about the
interrupt you real
yep,
quick? I
yep,
thought that would be
wrap it up.
a great spot to launch our poll question
Ah, okay,
that deals with
okay,
social. So it should be pushed to you and you'll see a pop-up on Zoom, except Robin, Jamel, and myself. But the question asks, in the book, Stiglitz lists ways that social media has been used to influence our democratic process. Do you use social media to engage with political peers, activists, or news? And then just rate how often you use it. Never, rarely, frequently, or a lot. And as you all vote, Jamel's going to wrap up our high-level summary.
okay. And so we were talking about why government. And if you haven't read that chapter, I encourage you to actually read the first few pages of it, because he talks about the fact that uh, throughout history, people have needed to handle certain things collectively. He talks about ancient rice farming, where irrigation was really important. Well, you know, you needed to work with others to share water and build irrigation systems. And communities also needed to think about defense or defending themselves against outside threats. Those are some natural things where people came together and worked together because no one individual could do things on their own. So he talks about the need for collective action, and that is really where government needs to step in. And he says we've gotten to a point in our country where there's so much push against government that people don't realize just how important it actually is to work and act collectively through government. He talks about the Constitution, you know, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, et cetera, provide for the common defense. All of those aspects are things that are associated with government. He has a really interesting discussion in there about how government actually establishes rules. And at least on the federal side, some of the ways in which rules are published for notice and comment, and people can actually participate in the rulemaking process. Everybody can see the rules as they develop. Not necessarily everything with respect to the statutes, because or the laws themselves, because that's done at the congressional level, but actual rulemaking by some of the agencies in government is something that is a very fairly open and transparent process. But what he says about that is because not everybody understands it, and because those corporations with a lot of means are able to focus on that and make their pitches and lobby even in the rulemaking process, their voices are heard more than others. And then finally, he talks about ways in which our government faces new challenges, and that the fact that our economies and larger economies are more complicated. And in that instance, you actually need government to do more to address things. And one of the things that he points out as an example is that companies and individuals, particularly companies, they don't necessarily have an incentive to clean up the environment. That is something that we're all interested in, but because they don't necessarily make money at it, those that are not based on environmental concerns, somebody like the government has to step in and look out and protect the common good. And so he goes through a series of examples of the types of things that a government now needs to step up and handle. The fact that we now live in more cities than we did in the past. The fact that cities themselves are more complicated communities to govern and to make sure that all the services are there than necessarily in a rural community. He points that out. He points out changing technology as being something that we have to address. And I think that I'll leave it at that, because we begin to get into the questions. But for all of these chapters, these 3 chapters, if you haven't had a chance to read them, I would really encourage you to read the first few pages of each one, because he kind of loads up front the main idea, and he provides some really good examples or some good things to think about.
Well, thank you, Jamel. And yeah, I really liked this week's reading. I thought it was very accessible and intriguing. So Well, everyone has voted in the poll, and so let's share the results on how often we use social media. So it looks like and use social media to engage with political peers, activists, or news. Um, 4 of you said never, 2 rarely, 6 frequently, and 3 a lot. So, Robin, I saw your answer in the chat because as hosts, we can't take it. But Robin said frequently. Jamel, where would you be?
I
Um,
answering somebody's question. That was
Oh yeah, sorry.
no worries. But yes, my answer is still frequently. More so a
I would
lot.
say I use it kind of rarely, and honestly, never, with respect to politics. Um, I feel like you go down a rabbit hole, and because I was in government for so many years until 2 years ago, I was always very careful about it. Now I'm just careful about it professionally. So I use it to post pictures of parties, vacations, I don't do the cat posting thing, but I use it mostly with friends just to stay in touch.
Nice. Well,
Yeah.
and I would say a lot for me personally.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm probably closer to a lot, actually, Wes, now that I think about it, because Twitter especially has provided a platform for a lot of people who before would not have had a way to get their voices and their ideas out. Um, and there are certain groups that have created spaces around their identity. I get a chance to learn from people who I don't have access to those communities directly, specifically around like disability activism. I don't well, I do now with my new job, but before I didn't know of any disability activists. I've learned a lot through them on Twitter. It also has allowed a lot of scholars from marginalized communities to be able to share their work and also their experiences in those spaces. So we're able to share stories and learn experiences from people who we might not have access to. So it's unfortunate that this mechanism that has provided such a useful vehicle for people to connect, it has also been manipulated in some of the ways that Stiglitz points out in this chapter. When I was doing the research for the more info section, some of the things that I learned from putting that together just blew my mind at what people are doing with big data and how they are manipulating us. Really
well,
take a look at the Cambridge Analytica one if you guys hadn't heard of that one.
yes, and I am seeing Brenda, shout out to Brenda. I use it a lot. I'm multitasking right now and reaching out to friends about registering to vote by tomorrow for the special elections in Texas. So multitask away. And then, Linda and Alexander mentioned how they don't use social media at all and how liberating and relaxing that brings. So, yeah, to each their own and what works best for you. So, thank you, everyone. We had 100% participation. That's awesome. All right. So let's go into our first question. And our first question is kind of a reflection one. And what do you remember from the 2008 financial crisis? How did it affect you or people that you know? And if you would like to participate, raise that Zoom hand. I already see we got some raised. And so, Mary, we are going to ask you to turn your mic on and then followed by Nelson.
First of all, it was a steady economic decline that preceded the wipeout in 2008. So it started, I think, late 2007, and housing prices started to drop, and the manipulation of instrumentality by banks and mortgage companies to basically sucker people into buying homes that were declining in prices, led to a major disaster. I mean, I know so many people lost their homes and became homeless, and the bailout was for the rich and not the poor that suffered a triple effect of loss of wealth, loss of their property, loss of their home, and loss of their jobs. And it was extremely devastating, and created homelessness and a lot of depression and mental illness as a result of it. And the government didn't intervene first, understandably to a certain extent, and not acceptably to a larger extent. So the social ills. I personally was able to hang on to the home, but barely. But a lot of people really were devastated in my community.
Thank you, Mary. We appreciate you starting us off. Nelson, go ahead.
Hey, good evening, everyone. Nelson calling in from the San Francisco Bay Area. Wow, 2008, boy, was that a crazy time, because lo and behold, I was actually working on Wall Street. Yes, I was working. Yes, I was working in an equity research department. I was like, oh my God, I finally graduated from Berkeley, graduated from Columbia. I was like, yeah, man, I'm in New York. I have to make some money, So I was in the equity research department, and I was like, yeah, I'm going to climb up to be a VP, managing director. Oh my God, the department dissolved. Oh my. And had Obama not extended those benefits, oh good Lord, I would have been on the street. It was horrendous. I was out of work for 5 years. And but I hustled really hard, and I was a really rare case of not carrying too much student debt. That can't be said by the majority of people in our nation right now. But after some deep crises, it actually spawned my work into progressive organizing. And I can't believe it, like right now, that I did work, 3 years ago for Bernie Sanders' campaign. Now here in California, we're fighting for single payer with our assembly in June. New York is trying to as well, but California's got a special mission. All the unions are involved, including the nation's largest nurses union. So while it was an upheaval, I think it is towards the benefit of society as a whole that we're fighting for this stuff now. So I'll hand that back to the room. Thank you.
Thank you, Nelson. Appreciate it. And it's, out of situations that are not pleasant, how that propelled you to get involved as an organizer. So yeah, so great, and good to see that has continued even up to this time. If you have a link to that CalCare initiative effort, put it in the chat so more people can learn about it. Anyone else? How did the 2008 financial crisis, what do you remember from it, and how did it affect you? Robin, go ahead. And then followed by Patricia.
So I was incredibly fortunate. Stiglitz talks a lot about people's access to knowledge and information, and Mary touched on this a little bit about how people were suckered into things because it's just not, a lot of things about our economy is not, that knowledge isn't prevalent. I was incredibly fortunate that I had someone that I could talk to at the time. And, I went to my dad and I was like, what does this mean? What is this, this, and this? And he broke it down and explained it to me. And I was able to buy a home with just a standard mortgage and avoid that. But kind of like what Mary said, they present this to you as if it's this great thing, because a lot of people don't have someone who is knowledgeable in the financial sector who can protect them from that. But then when the fallout did happen, I saw so many people, especially Black and brown people, low income people, um, lose homes and be at risk for not having a place to go, a place to live. And it wasn't just felt by those individual homeowners, it was felt by the people who were left as well, because now neighborhoods and property values have become devastated. So those people who were able to stay in their home values plummeted, their equity in their home plummeted. That affected their as people say, so much of middle class wealth is tied up in your home. And so now your property value has plummeted, your credit has now plummeted because so much of that is tied to your home value. It had a cascading effect even to people beyond who just lost their homes.
Thank you, Robin. Appreciate that. Patricia.
Hi, I'm Patricia from New Jersey, originally from New York. During that time, I remember I was trying to purchase a home for me and my 2 kids in New York and upstate New York. And I got involved with this company that I didn't know they were predatory lenders out of Long Island. They're now defunct. They're no more. They got rid of them. They stole a lot of money from a lot of hardworking people. At that time, I was working with the U.S. Postal Service. I recently retired from them after 32 years. But I remember feeling during the process that, you know, these people aren't regulated at all. I mean, because I remember the process was kind of sneaky. I was like, oh, they were telling me you have to say that, you know, this cousin that they staged for me in some part of the world I never heard of was lending me money. I was like, you know, why do I have to do all of that? I mean, my credit wasn't that bad. But anyway, the whole process, it marred my opinion of you know, lending institutions. Ever since then, you know, I'll never feel the same way again about borrowing money other than from a bank. You know, like right now I'm dealing with my bank and I'm thinking about, you know, using some money to purchase. But even now, I still feel kind of leery. You know, it'll always be on my mind because that was money, it was thousands of dollars that I never got back. So predatory lenders and the banking institution and the federal government allowed these predatory lenders exist. Yeah. They could have regulated, they could have investigated these companies before they allowed them to, you know, use the people as prey, which is what they did. I'll never forget the whole process. I mean, everything was staged from the beginning of the process to when I decided that this is enough. Nothing about it was right. And if any of you have ever dealt with these type of lenders, you know what I'm talking about. They're like thieves. And how could the government allow them to exist when the government is in everybody else's business and everybody else they have to regulate? The government is going to come in and check on them and make sure that, you know, but why didn't they do the same to these people? That was my question then. So it'll always be in the back of my mind, you know. You have to beware. The government regulates who they want to regulate, period.
I don't know if you're seeing, but there's some claps and noddings of heads there, Patricia. So thank you. Thank you for sharing your story as well. I'm going to go to Jamel and then we'll go to Mary.
Okay, I was in government at the time. So I was actually fortunate to, not lose my job. In fact, in some respects, there were a number of people who came to us from the private sector, from Wall Street, who decided to give government a chance at that point. And I was at the Treasury Department. I wasn't, a bank regulator or anything like that. I was focused more on anti-money laundering and anti-crime. But we did have people talk to us about what was going on, and some of it afterwards. And I think a couple of things that I'll just share with the group in terms of how some of the banking regulators looked at what had happened. And afterwards, they're trying to figure out, how did all of this happen? One of them was pointing out the fact that for so long, home ownership was considered such an important economic driver and such a way for people to buy property, have it increase in value, have that become something as a means of generating wealth. There was always this push for that and push for greater home ownership. And so on the congressional side, there was a big push for more home ownership. And as a result of that, they relaxed the rules with respect to what it means to provide lending. Now, did everybody behave responsibly? No. And as Mary and others have pointed out, hey, you might want to promote home ownership, but you have to do it in such a way that you do it responsibly. And people within the sector and some homeowners themselves, people who already had homes, because of the upward rise in prices, and you're being convinced, well, you're just sitting on all this wealth. Why don't you take some of it out? Why don't you do get some equity out of that by taking a loan, collateralized by your house? One banking regulator said it was as if people who had homes at that time or had them for a while were kind of treating them like ATM machines. They could get cash out. And again, all of these products were made by the financial institutions, not necessarily really focused on the lending itself, but on the fees that they could generate and the churn. That created kind of a disaster as well. So there were a couple of those folks, who talked about it within government, and they talked publicly about it as well, were people like the head of the FDIC, and some of the other banking regulators, and they shared that. But they acknowledged that we got into a pickle of our own making, because everybody thought that housing prices would always rise, never considered the fact that at some point the bubble would collapse, didn't consider the fact that there would be a whole lot of unscrupulous people out there just trying to take advantage of the situation as well. So I think one of the quotes in the book is that Chairman Greenspan said, did you not anticipate that the banks would be able to handle this? And the response was, no, we didn't. We thought that they would be able to manage. Bottom line is that there was a certain amount of faith, and maybe misplaced faith.
Thank you, Jamel, for sharing your governmental perspective and experience. Mary, and then we're going to move on to our next question.
I'm taking a more cynical approach than Jamel. These instruments and derivatives and all the crap that they call it, they were invented things to ensnare people, and they ensnared people of color at a higher rate, almost double the white white mortgage lending money to white homeowners, and the people that lost the most were double what white people lost. And so there's also a racial component to all this ensnaring, what I call ensnaring. It was not done in an upright way. It was predetermined, and there was a plan, and they carried out this devious plan in the middle of a fast rising market value, and then a sudden burst. You know, it's to a certain extent, I fail to believe that it's not a predictable thing, and what they were doing was against standard of the business. And so who's to blame? They're all to blame. Bank of America, for instance, the bailout of Chase. I mean, the Chase paying $75 million for the guy that had the Virgin Islands. He had the child trafficking ring, $75 million. You know, it goes on and on. It's like it's cyclical and it never ends. The greed never ends. And this was part of that greed. It's a historical greed, a massive, led it to 10 million people losing homes, and you know, and a huge amount of loss for the individual. And the banks got bailed out free of our taxpayer money. What happened to the banks? They got bailed out. They were too big to fail, but we were too small to not fail. And that's the biggest criticism I have of the situation, that you need government to defend the collectivity, the collective population, especially people of color.
Thank you, Mary. Robin.
Just really quick, following up to what Mary said, they actually did find, and I think there was a lawsuit. I know Wells Fargo was one of the key players, but there was a lawsuit. There was like a whistleblower who found that they were told to target Black and brown homeowners, and they were told to tell them whatever they needed to tell them to get them to sign on the dotted line. We had talked about it in a previous book club. I think it might have been The Sum of Us. And we have notes and things in there from that. But yeah, they definitely went after Black and brown homeowners with a fervor, and they got prosecuted for it. But in comparison, you know, it was nothing. Like Mary said, they were too big to fail, and we're too small to matter.
Thank you, Robin. And then Cartier, and if I pronounce your name incorrectly, please let me know. You should be getting a prompt. There you go.
So yeah, it's Carter, but I spell it weirdly, but it's Carter. So interesting enough, my uncle, gosh damn, my uncle worked for Wells Fargo, not in the security department, not the banking department, but it's a bank, you know. And he would be on his computer, and he would look up all these emails and be like, these are all fake emails. And he knew it. Like, he knew, like, he was a middleman in the company. Like, he had no big stakes. You know, he was just earning money, hopefully getting some money, hopefully using his degree from Berkeley. But he's actually in the Bay. He lives in the Bay Area still. Yeah, he basically knew it was defunct. Not defunct, but like, he knew that the emails that he saw were wrong, and all these account numbers were wrong, like basically falsifying data and all sorts of stuff, that there was no backing to it. Like, there was no file, you couldn't go in the cabinet, you couldn't go in the basement or some file, you couldn't do any of that. He couldn't report it, of course, because he didn't know how to. Like, there was no, like, he didn't know what to do. Like, it was just like, what do I do? To my boss? Like, I mean, it wasn't his department. he was securities. He was wasn't his department anyway. So like because Wells Fargo is so big. But anyways, it's just frustrating to me how big this is and still is, and how I don't want to get too far off track, but basically there's a debate now in the world that the American dollar is sort of falling apart. I'm not going to get into like the logistics of that, but maybe like the financial crisis over 10 years ago basically caused almost the collapse, not the collapse, but the denigrating of the US dollar.
No, appreciate it, Carter, and just makes me think like how not much regulation. For everything you all said, not a lot of regulation, in banking, but we'll certainly regulate, or some politicians want to regulate our social welfare programs but heaven forbid we do it to top earning corporations. So that's where mine went. So let's head to our next question. Love this discussion though. I put a link in the chat of an article I found just on the the racist structure of our lending and credit scores. So question 2, and Jamel, if you would like to lead this, take it away.
Sure. So Stiglitz says that while it was necessary to save the banks, he questions whether or not we should have saved the bankers, none of whom faced consequences for any misdeeds. So if you have a bank account, what is your relationship with your bank like? Do you know the people in the bank that serves you, or do you know anyone who works at any bank? How does your relationship with a bank differ from the relationship you think your parents might have had if they had a relationship with a bank? And then I saw somebody put in the comments, go to credit unions. I was just going to, where part of the question is, do you have any experience with a credit union? And maybe as we get into the questions, the responses, we can talk a little bit about that too. So let's see, where are the hands? I see Carter has their
Yes.
hand raised, his hand
Yes.
raised.
Hi.
Yeah, go ahead.
Cool. So I actually have a credit union, and credit unions, from my understanding, they're not like normal banks. They're they're normal banks in the sense that like they do what they did 50 years ago. Like they just, you put money in, you can take money out, your check that from your employer goes directly to the bank, and then you sort of and you can take out loans, you can like do the basic logistics, but you can't. There's certain laws and regulations that prevent them from like using your money for weird loan things. It really is restrictive on what it can do, which is good because it's not a bank where it used to be, which is great, and I think kind of important for like how we see how banks should operate, but don't always, because they don't, because a bank is a company, sadly.
Great points. Really glad that you've got that experience. Kathy, unmute yourself and enlighten us.
Sure, I'm all fart, and I've been a member of a credit union for 50 years, and got involved in it when I started teaching, and that became my, that's where I have my savings, my checking, and everything. And I know the people that work there. I know the people that are on the board. You know, because I bought my house decades ago, I didn't get a loan from there. I get my car loans from there. But I love the credit union. I feel like I trust them because it's from my community. I used to have bank accounts And I used to, I actually got involved in the 80s. My dad and I started buying CDs when it was like 17% interest. And that's the only time I did anything like that. But and we got lots, you know, the interest was really, really big on those. But it's just interesting watch how through history how everything is gone. And I do want to say from the last question what you guys were talking about in I retired in 2005 and in 2010 I had to put a well in and it was pretty expensive, and I tried getting a home equity loan to pay for it, and I was rejected even though my credit was outstanding. I think it was Bank of America. It was when everything was going on. And within that year, my house was destroyed through the tropical storm Irene. And I ended up getting a government loan, which actually helped me a lot with a very low percentage rate. But and I don't know too much about the government loans and you know stuff like that. I've managed to pay it off in a shorter time period. And but yeah, when I bought a house, it was $24,000 way back in '84. So I got a good jump on it there. Anyway, thanks. I love the discussion too.
Thank you. Thank you, Kathy. You raised some really good points, and we'll go to Robin. One quick thing. You said you know the people on the board of the credit union, and part of a credit union is made of members, and members actually vote, for who is on the board. I mean, the concept is that you have a little bit more control and say, and with respect to that and that type of institution than you would with another type of bank. Robin.
So you guys mentioned a little bit of what I was going to say. Most credit unions, actually, I think all credit unions are local. And by definition, I think in all of their charters, they are there to serve the communities where they exist. And like you said, Jamel, all of the, if you have an account there, you become not a customer, but a member and a part owner of the credit union. They have more responsibility to their constituents. I mean, they're not perfect, but they generally have more of a responsibility to their communities um, than banks do. I previously had a standard bank account so that I could send money to family back home, so that I could use ATMs back home when I would visit my family. But now with the prevalence of debit, Visa, check cards, I don't have to do that anymore. So I just got rid of them. Also, it is more likely that a credit union here in Durham, we have what's called the self-help credit union. A lot of times credit unions will be a little bit more difficult to get a loan and things like that because they don't do the predatory practices that banks do, where they will not be mindful of a person's current financial status. The credit union will try to work with people, and a little harder to get loans for that reason. But we also have a credit union here called the self-help credit union, which is deliberately exists to help low income people build their credit and to have a checking account, because a lot of times if you don't have a checking account, that severely limits how you are able to participate in society if you don't have a checking account.
Yeah, good points. The people, the whole notion of the underbanked, because so much depends on a banking relationship or some kind of financial markers. It's there is a push to get more people into the system one way or another, whether it's through a credit union, whether it's through something like the self-help thing, or a regular bank. Annette, you got your hand.
I've heard
We
great-
haven't heard from you tonight, so thank
Yeah.
you.
I've been thinking though, don't worry. The reason why I have the bank that I have, I actually don't know how far it extends to. I came from California where for a while I was with Bank of America and those big ones. The reason why, believe it or not, the reason why I have the bank that I have is because when I was moving from California to Pennsylvania, it was the only bank that would allow me to open up an account while I was still in California. I needed to be able to have, a local bank because I was buying a home here and I needed to have a place to put the money from the sale of my home in California. I had to put it somewhere. And I called around to the various banks in my area, and it was the only one at the time. It was called Integrity Bank, and it was the only one that would allow me to do that. So since then, it's been taken over by an entity called S&T Bank, but I have no idea. I have no idea how big or how extensive it is. I certainly never heard of these banks when I was in California. It's not like Wells Fargo or Bank of America or one of those big ones. So that's why I bank where I do, and my financial needs are very simple, very basic. Checking, savings, and I did need a home line of credit, and it accepted that, and it, so I'm very simple.
Thank you, Annette.
Mhm.
So, really good discussion about our relationships with our financial institutions. Some we trust more than others, and people definitely have talked about what Stiglitz kind of he actually describes as gambling. The all of these products and derivatives, securities, so many of the new financial products out there are a way for almost professional corporate gamblers to go out there and generate fees, and again earn wealth, not through labor itself, but a really typical thing we described last week in terms of the renter, the renter's economy. But Wes, I think we probably should move on to the next question.
Yes, Annette, I see your hand raised. Did you have something else to say real quick?
Yes, real quick. This has mainly to do with the first question. I have to say, I was very disappointed that this whole bailout in 2008 happened under Obama. That's a real disappointment to me, and I keep asking why. Why again? Why were the bankers all bailed out, and the people who actually lost were not? So that's all.
Thank you. Mary?
Mary, you're on mute.
Obama inherited this mess. We were on the brink of a depression. I remember them saying it over and over again. We're gonna fail as a country if we don't bail these banks out. And so, he did the most. He moved on advice of his cabinet, and it wasn't a lone decision. It was an emergency decision, and it was, in retrospect, I think it was a terrible deal for the American public, but we were to the point where the international community was going to fail. So it was all tumbling, and I think a global depression was on the brink, and that's why I think he had to do something emergent, and this was the only way that he could solve things systematically and bring up and raise up our expectations and our trust, some kind of level of trust.
Yeah, and I just jump. I mean, I do think that a lot of people think it could have been a lot worse. If the government didn't act, and at the same time, what Stiglitz points out in his book is that there was an expectation that there would be reform afterwards as well, and that was whittled away by some of the big interests. And so those are some of the things that he talks about within the book, that yes, the bailout occurred. Some kind of bailout was necessary, but the way that it happened and then afterwards not having things fixed was something he's quite concerned about. Patricia.
Okay, this
Can
is
you unmute Patricia? There you go.
yeah, this is in response to Wes's question about the credit unions and how the government was going after the credit unions at one time. The government got scared. They really, because people was pulling their money out of the banks and they were running to the credit unions and opening up accounts. So the government said, well, we have to look into these credit unions and we're going to make sure that we put fees and we're going to stop them from doing this and make them do that. Well, my credit union, and I'm sure all of the credit unions did this, went to its constituents, the people, and told them to contact your congressmen and your senators, and you tell them to leave your credit union alone. And I did, and I know everybody else did. And we don't see, that tells you something about the
Well, you accidentally went on mute, Patricia. Yeah.
power than we think we do. See, it's a psychological game. The government wants you to think that you're just one little person and that you have no power. But in actuality, we come to.
You're on mute again.
Because they really didn't mess with our credit unions, and this is throughout the country. This is not just my credit union; these are all the credit unions in the country. So we have more power than we think.
It is, and part of that is it is a member-driven organization, not purely, but that's the concept there. Wes, should we move on? Yeah.
Yes, we're going to move on. And just for the sake, loving this discussion and really appreciate multiple thoughts being shared. As we go about, try to limit your thoughts to 1 or 2 minutes, just so that we can get through as many of the questions as possible in the next 20-ish minutes. So question 3, and it kind of goes to action, and a great segue from your comments, Patricia. Considering an economics framework, how does individualism affect American identity in our politics? Oh, this was not the one I was thinking of. Sorry. Considering an economics framework, how does individualism affect American identity and our politics? What are some of the primary factors inhibiting our ability to act collectively? What does the balance needed for a well-functioning society look like? So in a way, yeah, never mind. I'm seeing the connection I first thought, Patricia, but yeah. What do you all think? I'm really focused on that middle part. What are some of the primary factors inhibiting our ability to act collectively? All right, Carter.
Yeah, okay, good. So one of the things that I really think is the key here is, the lack of faith in our institutions. We have lack of faith in government. We have lack of faith in our banks. We don't trust anyone. We really don't. And no matter what political aisle you stand on, whether policy you support or against, I don't know. It's not about party lines. It's not about what sports team you want to follow. I mean, because frankly, politics these days is basically sports teams. Is in the fandom. Is we don't trust, like, the idea of government is like the John Locke idea of, everyone sort of puts an idea, one thought together and it makes government. That's the sort of principle, a very basic principle. I'm oversimplifying it, of course, but that's the basic idea. The problem is that we don't have trust in any of that. And so in order to sort of start in its primary basic function, is that we have to trust the systems. And if the systems are corrupt or broken or don't, or people just stay in office, or if no one does anything, takes action, and they just sort of stay in the status quo because they don't want to deal with it. Also, it's bureaucracy. I mean, bureaucracy is good and bad. There's a lot of factors in terms of, I can probably shut up, but there's so many factors in terms of things are not run properly, or there's too much regulation, too less regulation. It's just the constant idea of like, we can't do anything because the institution is completely broken, or we don't trust the system, therefore we don't do anything. It's just this complicated mess of like, something has to get done, put one foot forward and something will happen, but I just don't know what, And problems, of course, don't fix, like mental health. Your mental health is not fixed overnight. It's a process of constantly working on the issue.
Thank you, Carter. I was trying to get thoughts put in the chat when you mentioned sports and how politics is like sports. It made me think of a book, Lou, you read, oh gosh, I don't even know, probably 3-4 years ago. Politics is for power, and Eitan Hirsch uses the analogy of how the political hobbyism and how we treat it like sports teams. So, and I loved what you said about trust. Go ahead, Patricia, and then Kathy.
You mentioned individualism and why it doesn't, my thought was a fear. People are afraid. The powers that be create situations or scenarios or, an effect of things when people do speak up. You get spanked. They tap you on your hand. Don't speak up. Because if you speak up, then this will happen. If you do that, then this will happen. These are things, it's fear. It was done in Europe with Hitler. You scared the people. So when you do speak up, or when you do, voice an opinion that's against the status quo, there are consequences. So that's what keeps people, that's why we're here. Isn't that why we're here? We're discussing these issues amongst ourselves. And this is where it starts. It's a good thing, because this is how it starts. But people are afraid of individualism, of being different, of change, because there are consequences. That's all.
Thank you, Patricia. Kathy, go ahead.
On an individual level, I live in a small town, but people are so spread out in their belief systems. Some people will just keep on charging and paying minimum payments on things, where other people I know have hundreds of thousands of dollars in the bank, and yet they don't spend any of them. Don't spend money. I don't know how the government could do it, because I just, just people that I know, and the variety of belief systems are just, someone else shared that they were pretty simple. I'm pretty simple. I'm I'm not into stocks or anything like that. I get that 2% on anything, to just get, yeah, I'm not a gambler at all. Um, you know, and yet the world is so, the community, my community is, and I'm sure it's across the world, or across the, our government, that the variety is, the variety just, I don't know how they can reach any one way of doing, what the best way would be, because I don't agree with my best friends and family. So I don't, anyway.
There certainly is a lot of different thoughts of how to go, and I can see how that affects our collectivism. Annette.
Mute here. Okay, there we go. There we go. I've done a lot of thinking about individualism as opposed to collectivism over the years. Presently, I'm kind of the opinion that America is too individualistic, and yet you have Eastern societies where the individual is basically completely submerged into the collective, and that's a little bit on, that seems to be a little bit too far, and somehow we need to come to, some kind of a middle ground. And humans, as a rule, are not very good about that. We're either this way or we're that way. That's just how we are. I'm probably jumping ahead, but one of the things that I really appreciated that Stiglitz said in the third chapter is that he says that there's really no self-made person. We have an infrastructure in the global society, or just in our society, we have an infrastructure that allows us to succeed or not. So the person who says, yes, I'm a self-made businessman, blah, 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 yakety, yakety, yak, they couldn't succeed with a whole lot of other things being in place for them, whether it's the financial world, whether it's the technological world. We're not self-made people. We are very interdependent. And I wish that we as a country understood that. And so this thing of I'm an individual, I'm in a free country, and I should be able to do what I want to do when I want to do it, and being so stubborn about that to the detriment of others. And I wish that we as a country just understood our interdependence. I mean, just think about what goes into the fact that I can go to a store and pick up a melon, and what went into being able to pick up that melon. For one thing, it came all the way from South America probably, and is in my store in the middle of winter, and the infrastructure that it took to have that melon there. So we're not self-made people. We are so so dependent on one another. And I think one of my biggest fears is what happens when some of those things start getting knocked down, and the domino effect that it's going to have. So yeah, I wish we understood that more, and that we really are either all going to fail together or we're all going to succeed together, or at least survive anyway.
Thank you, Annette. And, that's, I think, a big point of, Heather McGhee when writing The Sum of Us, and recognizing that. And I think that as I think two everyday solutions that we all can start doing is, one, you know, Annette, you asked the question, well, that melon, how did it get here? Why am I able to buy this? You know, and making people think that through when, you know, we discuss issues and politics. And then I think too, just sharing our personal stories, because the more, you know, and I love how Robin, you know, always shares how she believes in the power of story. And I think as we continue to share our stories, that individualizes the work, but it also draws people in to collectively address that work. And so I think it humanizes, individualizes through stories, but then it allows us to bring more people to the table and to do the work. Go ahead, Annette.
This brings me to a poem, and the poem was about boiling an egg. And I thought, yeah, that's pretty basic. And she goes into this whole infrastructure that creates the ability to boil the egg. First of all, you have to get the egg. Where did the egg come from? How did it get to your store? Okay, so that was the first one. Then you have to get the water. So where did the water come from? The water comes from a central location in your city, and someone is taking care of your water and making sure that it's drinkable, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so she goes into all of that. Then you have to have the stove. And who made the stove? And how did you get the stove? And then you have to have the heating ability for that stove to heat the water for you to boil your egg. It was, you know, it's just like, oh, that's pretty amazing. It's amazing that I can boil an egg in my home.
If you have a digital access to that poem, put it in the chat or send it to an email so that we can include it in follow-up material. Thanks, Annette.
Yeah.
Nelson.
Hey, well, you know, I think what is going to drive collectiveness, at least, you know, the next 15 years, next 20 years, is that there's going to be a big upheaval, because, you know, the environmental cleavages are just too deep right now, right? I mean, we're kind of this decade. You know, for example, California, you know, over 30% of the population is going to be over 65. We actually don't have enough young workers to replace that revenue right now. And we kind of created this, you know, these systemic problems, right? We don't have housing, we don't have accessibility. So kind of what I feel is going to drive collectiveness as a nation is that there are a lot of our, you know, our coastal cities and our major cities are going to rewrite a lot of what justice and equity is, right? Right. I mean, it basically, we do have to create social housing in a lot of places that where a lot of you know, younger Gen X and basically the entire millennials have not been able to set up lives, right? And a lot of it is predicated on financial institutions, you know, gaming it where, you know, resources stay at the top 20% and the top 5%, right? I mean, in California, the top 5% supplies over 55% of the tax revenue, right? That's not going to exist forever, right? So, I mean, so right now I feel like kind of like some places where supply can be created, like Texas, they're kind of surviving by drawing in, you know, migration. But for places that are wealthy, like California, New York, and Florida, they have to do a big overhaul on what social justice looks like. And they are. That's what they're electing in, and that's what's happening. So, and that will drive collectivism. Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Nelson. Mary.
Did you say that Texas drives migration to Texas? It's Nelson? Nelson?
Yes, they're actually at almost a 35 billion surplus the past budget cycle because over what 3 million, I don't know the exact number, but somewhere between 5 and 7 million over the past decade have left their states and moved to Texas, and everything's flowing there. And they're working with money in really interesting ways. Okay, so I went there for a wedding in March, and it was my first time in Texas. I was in Dallas. I was like, well, what do poor people do, right? Because I'm too used to this New York, California, Florida thing, right? And then what I was told by my Uber driver was that they can't give fully public health care, but what they can do is that the good old boys at the top tell their friends at the insurance companies, we're making a system. And so the system is, if you make under $50,000 in Texas, you can insure yourself for only $40 a month, and your maximum out of pocket for anything is $500. So it's kind of like, even places that do not kind of marshal in these like deep progressive measures are trying to fit it in their own sneaky ways. And it's really interesting to see, you know, because out here in California, we're like fighting for like state control. But like, you know, New York is trying as well, like a little bit. But, you know, Texas is, it's interesting. It is interesting. But here, I'll hand the mic back to you, please.
No, I just think that dumping the immigrants onto other states is and creating a havoc with an international border takes away any of their positives. And I defend California and New York for doing the humanitarian thing, cost what it will. They have a legal right, international legal right, to cross the border and end up in the country of choice if they're proven to, you know, to have a viable case for immigration and escaping their countries. But all that said, I forgot my point. The collectivism versus the individualism, you know, the collectivism is what we need for a healthy democracy. Individualism we need for expansion and innovation and solving our evolved problems that are evolving by the minute. And so we need some kind of partnership between the two, and we need to also to teach that in elementary school, and you know, basic human rights, basic it's something that a definition of society, a notion of society, a notion of collectivism, a notion of solving problems together as opposed to working individually for an exam to achieve a higher merit and opportunities. There's a balance, and I think that balance needs to be established very early on. We're missing the boat on that. We need to do values training. We need to do basic reformation and federalizing educational policy that includes these things, that includes training in democracy and community spirit. We're not 350 million individual souls living in one country. We have to come to terms with our collectivism, and I think the other party is making people think in polarity. They're you know, reducing the democracy, emphasizing autocracy, emphasizing, you know, the will of one person over the will of others, and that is not going to survive our massive problems that we have facing even another war in the Middle East between Israel, Gaza, Iran, and who knows who else. Now Saudi Arabia. I mean, you know, we're just faced with an incredible amount of tension on a global and on a country level, and we need to come to terms with living as a society and not as individuals. It's not about money anymore. It's about how we're going to survive the future and all these crises, one after another. You know, at the same time as the Middle East had a crisis, Afghanistan, you know, in one fell swoop, 20,000 people dead. Libya, fires, volcanic eruptions. I mean, it just keeps going around and around and more frequent. So we have to think as unified people. We're all Americans, whether we want to or not. We have to solve problems as Americans.